Good evening, everyone. And welcome to what's going to be a very absorbing lecture, not really. I'd say more candid remarks from the heart by our guest tonight. This lecture, these remarks, are made possible by the Brackenridge Conservancy, Lucifer Lighting Company, and the McNay Art Museum. We really thank the McNay very much. This is such a beautiful setting, and you will really enjoy what's about to happen. Frank was a guest of the local AIA chapter in 2011. He came to speak about his work. He is a prominent architect from Raleigh, North Carolina. He began his career, I believe, in New York with Richard Meyer Architect, and when he came to work there, he worked with Todd Williams. It was later that he established his practice, and in 2011, when he presented to the AIA chapter in San Antonio, he went through his work over the years. This is a different lecture. This lecture tonight is not about the architecture per se. It's about sketching and place and, I would say, tender feelings that come from absorption of nature in built space. You can read about Frank's accolades online. I'm at this point wanting to let you know that his beloved wife, Judy, was from San Antonio, and when he came then, we were with Judy. His daughter Laura is with us this evening. Suzanne and I, my wife, and our children have come to know Frank over the years, and we've tried to get him here for several years, and this has finally happened tonight. He has taught drawing courses or sketching at national AIA conferences, and I took one of them in Philadelphia with him, learned about vanishing points, and he started a newfound hobby that has brought a lot of joy. There's a book that he's published which is quite special called Native Places, and Drawing is a Way to See, and it's available this evening to purchase. This is a very special man who has almost become adopted by our family, and it gives great pleasure to introduce him to you. You made the right decision to come here tonight. This will be one of the more memorable experiences I think you could have from someone who has a lot of important wisdom to pass on. So Frank, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gilbert. Gilbert, I've been introduced more than once, but yours is the most sincere and touching introduction that I know of. Thank you. Well, tonight, I'm mostly going to talk about one thing, and two things, but I'm going to illustrate it with only one building, which is the one that you see here. It's what is known as an outdoor classroom. It's built in a prairie in North Carolina. You probably didn't know that we had prairies in North Carolina, but we did once. We had bison. And I want to use this building to illustrate the importance of sketching and drawing as a way to see, but also to illustrate the value of writing as a way to think about design. Not to write about design, but as a way to think about design. As Gilbert mentioned, I have a book called Native Places, and in the book, I have a sketch that I've made at some point. I've kept a sketchbook since I was a teenager. And I take one of those sketches, and when I feel like it, I write something about that sketch. So here's a sketch I made of a stream that I played in when I was a child. And on the right is what I wrote about it. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read it to you, because both are important as a way to think about design. Creek children. When I imagine the perfect classroom, it has a creek running through it. You see, I grew up by a creek. I discovered Buffalo Creek near our home when I was 6 years old and played there until I was 12. I can't remember much of what I learned in school during those years, but I'll never forget what I learned at Buffalo Creek. Children raised by creeks are never bored. Creek children don't know about learning by rote, neither are they conditioned to working 9 to 5. Berries are their first discoveries, and birds' nests, and watching the stars come out. Later, only later, they discover books. To Creek children, learning is discovery, not instruction. Occasionally, I return to my creek where the water is still clear and the crawfish are plentiful. No place I've ever known has been nicer to me than Buffalo Creek. There's Buffalo Creek for real. Much of tonight's lecture is going to be about the little girl that you see on the right and the nature teacher that she became. Her name is Mary Ann Britton, and this photograph is of Mary Ann when she's perhaps 7 years old. And she grew up in a very established North Carolina family, well-connected politically, and her mother wanted Mary Ann to be this lovely, beautiful little girl wearing frills and pretty clothes and, you know, doing all the things that little girls, pretty little girls from well-connected families did. But Mary Ann was much more interested in bugs and snakes and cicadas and salamanders, much to her mother's disdain. Luckily, Mary Ann had an older brother, Bill, who kind of took her away and taught her the joy of nature. She told me once that Bill went out into the woods with her and he heard a bird singing and he could tell what the bird was just from the song. She thought that was the most amazing thing. So, Mary Ann Britton. This is Mary Ann Britton when I met her. And at that time, she was the director of education for the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, arguably the best museum of natural sciences on the eastern seaboard. That's their building that you see there on the left in downtown Raleigh. Mary Ann was fearless. If she saw anything in nature, whether it was a rattlesnake or an insect or a giant salamander like the one she's holding here, which is called a hellbender, it's about this long, very slippery, weighs about 6 pounds. Whenever she saw something like that, she wanted to touch it. You know, she just had this instinctive love of nature. I've never met anybody like that. And she was also the sort of person who, if you spent more than 5 minutes with Mary Ann, you would learn something new. You know, it's always been an ambition of mine to make every sentence I write say something new. Mary Ann just had that quality. So, one day, I knew Mary Ann because she and her colleagues had taught my children about nature at the Museum of Natural Sciences. They had a great outreach program. One day, Mary Ann comes to me and says, "Frank, I want you to help me create a prairie." And I didn't know anything about prairies in North Carolina. Of course, I've been to Texas and Kansas, and I've seen prairies there. But it turns out that North Carolina used to look like what you see in the lower part of this slide. 10,000 years ago, as the glaciers receded, you can see the glaciers receding up there, there were mammoths, bison, giant sloths, saber-toothed tigers. and the first signs of indigenous people. And these indigenous people lived in a vast expanse of prairie right in the middle of North Carolina, where Mary Ann and I lived in Raleigh, North Carolina. She said, I want you to, the museum owns some land out on the edge of town. In the upper photograph, you see a photograph of that land. Right now, it's a cow pasture, but I want us to turn it into prairie. And I want you to make a classroom where students can come, children, adults, and learn about nature just by being there. They don't need a book. I just want them to learn by being there. Now, what you're looking at is a pasture that's mostly one kind of grass. It's fescue grass. It's a largely barren landscape. As you can see in the photograph below, it's a much richer landscape. So the first time she took me out there to see it, it was all a little overwhelming for me, the idea that A, there were prairies in North Carolina, B, that this charismatic teacher was asking me to make a building, and C, it was right next to a military base, you know. This is the North Carolina National Guard, and right next to that cow pasture is enough equipment to arm a small nation. And I thought, well, that's a contrast, that and nature. But Mary Ann, we walked around what was going to become the prairie, and she said, one day we'll have bobolinks here. For those of you who don't know, a bobolink is a bird about the size of a mockingbird. It travels in flocks, and it lives in prairies. And bobolinks hadn't been seen in North Carolina in living memory. That's a little bobolink sketch I made on the left. I mostly knew about a bobolink from this famous poem by Emily Dickinson, in which she explains why she doesn't go to church. So how does one design a classroom where children learn from nature? What Mary Ann taught me was, in her way of educating, there are no teachers. Everyone's a teacher. And, you know, everyone, in fact, is a student. And so her ideal classroom is what you see here. It's people gathered around in a circle where everyone is equal and everyone puts forward what they've seen. Her typical way of going out with children would be for them to run around for 3 hours in a natural setting, come back, have lunch, and then talk about what they've seen. Perfect way to learn about nature. That's what she wanted for this classroom that she asked me to design. In the lower right, you can see a little plan sketch, a very early sketch. And you can see a circle. You can see a part that's hatched, which is going to be, you know, restrooms, storage, maybe a little office. You can see the path of the sun. It's going to face due south. And you can also see where the prevailing southwest wind comes. Prevailing southwest wind, which you actually send us from Texas, is the primary cooling breeze in the summer in North Carolina. You know, most of the time we design buildings in plan. This building I designed in section. And here you can see a very early sketch of the section. And what I'm after is trying to make a building that rests on the ground on only 2 points. It's not a really large building. It's, you know, about 1,500 square feet, about the size of this auditorium, actually. But I wanted it to rest on the ground as lightly as possible and not disturb the earth. So here was a sketch about ways that we might try to do that. And you can see on the left-hand side where you come in, there's going to be a very low ceiling, and then the building will open up to the south and look out over the prairie. After we worked on it for a while, Sarah Queen, who was in the office, started calling the building a cricket. She liked the way that it sat on the ground and it somehow reminded her of a cricket. You know? So thereafter, it got to be known as the cricket. And there's a little sketch I made. Now, I make sketches for two reasons. I think most of us do. One is to try to understand what I'm looking at. The very earliest sketch I show you was that creek. And I was trying to remember what it was that was so important to me about that creek, where I found the crawfish and when it flooded and where the birds nested. All the things about it. So a sketch is a way to understand what I'm looking at. And then it's also a way to remember it. If I take a photograph of something, I'll forget it. And I'll also probably lose the photograph. But if I make a sketch of something, I'll remember it forever. I can look at sketches I made when I was 18 years old, and I can remember who I was with and where the sun was and what time of year it was, just from that sketch. And then the third way to use a sketch is to try to project some feeling about what it is I've designed. So as you can see, I wanted this building to be this very light little thing that perched on the hillside and let nature run through it. This is a site plan of the building, and what's interesting here is that everybody had to walk to the building. You go along a little path and you're going downhill, and then you come into the building. And we located the building really carefully so that it touched 4 important ecological systems. To the right is pine forest, very common in North Carolina. To the left was going to be the prairie that we created. Down below that is a creek and a bottomland that's connected to that creek. And it's not an ephemeral creek, it's a creek that flows all year long. And then the yellowish part is a bottomland with all its special kinds of plants as well as animals like salamanders. So just think, you've got a classroom that opens to these 4 really important ecologies. The section on the right shows how in the summer the cool wind can come up the hill and go through the building. It shows how when the building is in use in winter, those solid elements on the north side block the colder winds. And of course, the 2 sun angles show you how the building can be heated in winter by the sun, and the sun can be blocked in the summer. One of the things I knew from my growing up around my children when they were growing up was that they love skeletons. Children just are fascinated by skeletons and dinosaurs. Show a child a dinosaur and you've got a friend. Well, these are, in the Museum of Natural History, are some of the skeletons that they had there. And the one at the top is of a whale that washed up on a beach in North Carolina and was preserved, and that skeleton's 100 years old. And I later learned that when Mary Ann Britton was 15 years old and going to a college nearby, she'd come every Sunday and just sit there for hours looking at that skeleton. On the lower left is another skeleton that's actually on the side of our prairie. If you want to preserve a skeleton, the best thing you can do is to bury it in the ground and let all the insects clean it up for you, and then you dig it up 2 years later. So that's another way of saying we wanted the structure of our building to be as clear and fascinating as a skeleton, so that a child might stand in the outdoor classroom and realize that that sloping beam, that's interesting, isn't it? And see every element of the building as it comes together. I had a really brilliant structural engineer who worked with me on this. His name is Tim Martin. This is an inexpensive building. It cost $250,000. We didn't have a lot of, we couldn't use a lot of exotic materials, so Tim's designed this entire structure so that it can be made of 2x6s, 2x8s, and 2x12s with a few judicious parallam beams. Everything's exposed, nothing's painted. A group of my former students, I'm now an adjunct professor at North Carolina State University School of Architecture. A group of my former students built the building in 3 months during the summer. And here you can see it going up. Those of you who like to watch buildings under construction, as I do, know that a building will never look as good as it does when it's under construction. It's just so fascinating to see it going together. So here are a sequential set of photographs of them pulling things together. Now, as you can see, we didn't move the earth at all. We cleaned off the grass, perched the building on the hill, and let the grass grow back. When the building was framed up and got to this stage, Mary Ann Britton and I stood on this platform and we just hugged each other. It was so beautiful. It was just what we wanted. The idea that it could be a classroom and you could look out over a prairie, you could see the bottomland, the pine forest, and the creek. Now, we need to remember this is a typical classroom today, sadly. No windows or very tiny windows, desks lined up in rows. Contrast the learning that might take place in that situation versus the learning that might take place in this classroom. And I should also say it's really important to realize that the learning doesn't take place in the classroom. Mary Ann wanted children and adults to come here, have a brief introductory session, tell them what to do about mosquito bites, where the bathrooms are, what we're going to have for lunch, and then you turn them loose. And they go out in the 600 acres with butterfly nets or whatever they need to explore what they're after, and to come back at lunchtime and tell everybody about it. While the structure was being framed up, some staff at the museum came out and broadcast seeds from prairies. In the distance, you can see a blue tractor that's plowing over the fescue grass. And these interns are using seeds that are collected on what are called remnant prairies in North Carolina. From 10,000 years ago, there's still a few patches of that prairie left. And a company collects the seeds from that and sells those seeds to people like Mary Ann. So the prairie grew up. I thought it was all looking so beautiful, and a year later, they burned it. Because that's an important part of the life of a prairie. The indigenous people would burn the prairies. Lightning would start a fire at a prairie. So they were largely barren of trees. So again, the lower photograph shows the fescue cow pasture that Mary Ann first took me to. And the upper photograph shows the outdoor classroom after the prairie has grown for only 2 years. And it's amazing. I remember when we first went out to the fescue, it was quiet, You could hear an airplane going over. But go out to this prairie on a morning in the summer, and the sound of the insects is almost deafening. One of the ways you know you've got a prairie is you have a certain number of key prairie species, mainly insects. So in order to certify that this was a prairie, the staff would come out here at regular intervals, do a transect, and count every insect. So this is the real story of the outdoor classroom at Prairie Ridge. It's all screened in. It's very comfortable, even on the hottest day in summer. You can go out there when it's 95 degrees on a summer's day, and the children are in the classroom listening to Mary Ann, and the classroom is at 80 degrees because of the breeze that's sweeping up the hill and the fact that it's in shade, and then it's open air. So they come to the classroom, they get a little briefing from Mary Ann, and then they're out to explore. This is the real outdoor classroom. It's not the building. The building was meant to be like a way station that you come to and leave and come back to. You know, these are the sort of photographs that you normally see of buildings. These are beautiful photographs. They're taken by Tim Hersley. But the real activity in the life of the building are the people who use it. After the building had been in use for about 4 years, an elementary school teacher from Mebane, North Carolina, was a docent, and she was walking across the prairie one afternoon, and she saw a flock of birds that she'd never seen before. She was a keen ornithologist. She goes back and gets out her Peterson's Field Guide and discovers that they're bobolinks. Here I was some years earlier with Mary Ann Britton with her shock of white hair striding across the prairie saying, "One day we'll have bobolinks." And we did. I've told you this story. One thing I forgot to mention is the fact that the building is, of course, totally off the grid. It generates all its own electricity. It has its own wastewater treatment system. It collects all its rainwater to use for washing hands. It's as off-the-grid building as I've ever done. But like I say, the real story of this building is about one person and the vision she had about the best way to learn. Here's another story. The person you see in this photograph is Elizabeth Brim. She's photographed here at her studio in Penland, North Carolina. This is up near Mount Mitchell. Elizabeth weighs 110 pounds. She's got the grip of a blacksmith because she is a blacksmith. That's her studio, and she asked me to design a blacksmith studio for the Penland School of Crafts. You know, up until about 150 years ago, every town and village had a blacksmith. It was a key person in society. Much less so today, but it was so thrilling to learn about this craft that it was 10,000 years old, the making of instruments out of iron, especially by someone as talented as Elizabeth. You may notice that she's wearing a pearl necklace. Well, like Mary Ann Britton, Elizabeth came from a very proper family, and her mother just thought it was not dignified for a young woman to be a blacksmith. That's all, what big, burly, strong men did, But Elizabeth knew that blacksmithing was not especially about brute strength. It was about finesse. And that's what she brought to it. So one of her friends said, "Well, Elizabeth, why don't you just wear a pearl necklace and that'll make your mother feel better about the whole thing." So ever since she's worn She's worn a pearl necklace. And here's the sort of thing that she made. It's a tutu made out of iron. And when I met Elizabeth and she showed me that, it just blew me away. Here's one of the strongest materials on earth, steel, iron, and she's making one of the most delicate things you can imagine, an iron tutu. I loved that. And I knew that, you know, any building I did, if it just allowed Elizabeth and her skill to come through, it was going to be a great building. Now, let me get to the part about Texas. When I moved to North Carolina in 1981, I was befriended by a very distinguished architect whom you see in this photograph. His name was Harwell Hamilton Harris. And for 5 years, he had been the head of the architecture program at the University of Texas. He did legendary things when he was there. He then moved twice in Texas and ultimately migrated to North Carolina, where I met him. Here are 4 of his buildings, and what you will see they have in common is that they're all very different. As Gilbert mentioned, I worked for Richard Meyer for several years. And with Richard Meyer, you knew what kind of building you were going to get when you hired him. It was going to be made out of white stuff and glass. And about half of it would be solid and pure white, and the other half would be glass with white mullions. And that was it. And that became his brand, whether it was for a house in Connecticut or a museum on a hillside in Los Angeles. That was his medium. And that was the school I came out of. You know, that's what I thought. You know, architects need to create a brand, if you will, that, you know, that's how we are in America. Well, Harwell, by contrast, felt that every building was unique. Every client was unique, every site was unique, its climate, the particular materials you had to build it with. So starting in the upper left-hand corner is his home and studio in Raleigh, North Carolina. To the right of that is a house in the Hollywood Hills for Ralph Johnson. Over on the far right is the Trainer House in Abilene, Texas. The most beautiful house. Harwell took me there. And in Abilene, the owners of the house were very conscious of sandstorms and fierce weather. And they wanted Harwell to create a house where there would be an inner sanctum of calm. And so this is the main living area of the house. It's like a courtyard, and it has skylights and a beautiful fountain. And on the lower left is a house that he did for Greta Granstead in Hollywood. They're all very different. You'll also notice how beautifully he draws, sketching. Drawing is a way to see. In my opinion, Harwell is the first modern architect in the United States to actually talk about the importance of regionalism. You know, you have a strong tradition in Texas of building in a region. You had great architects like O'Neill Ford. You have many great architects now working in Texas. This is what Harwell wrote in 1952. To be expressed, an idea must be built. And to be built, it must be particularized, localized, set within a region. Now, we live in a world today, especially an academic world, which is a world of theory. And there are certain ways that you do things. There are certain ideas that we have. Harwell is saying an idea is very important, but it must be particularized, localized, and set within the place where it's going to be built. What are important are not the limitations of a region. We often think of region, you know, if we build in a region, we're limited. We're not cosmopolitan. We're not part of the world. He says, and what are important are not the limitations of a region, but the resources of a region. A region's most important resources, get this, are its free minds, its imagination, its stake in the future, its energy, and last of all, its climate, its topography, and the particular kinds of sticks and stones it has to build with. I thought that was so important when he told me that. Because what it means is that it's not, you know, we usually think of regionalism as, oh, well, we've got California and we've got Redwood. We think of regionalism in New Mexico, you know, we've got harsh sunlight and stucco. He says that's the last part of regionalism. The most important part of regionalism are the people and their free minds. This is a house he also took me and Judy to in Berkeley, California for Weston Havens. And that's actually a chain link railing that you see around it. It's 1941, maybe the most beautiful house I've ever seen. Every building is a portrait, he said. A portrait of its client or its place, its topography, or even its materials. So this is my last image. And it's a little piece I wrote about a house in eastern North Carolina that belonged to Mrs. Daughtry. And at the time, I had a house I was building on the coast, and I would drive from Raleigh about every 2 weeks down to see the construction in progress. And I kept going by this little house, just a little cabin with a swept yard, a couple of chickens, and some trees. And one day I got up the nerve to pull my car over, because you never know what you're going to find. You know, and went up and introduced myself. I drove by her house 10 miles east of Trenton, North Carolina, every month on my way to the coast. She grew yellow flowers outside the front porch in a little square garden next to a swept yard. Chickens pecked for bugs under the house. Mrs. Daughtry was sitting on her porch snapping string beans when I stopped to introduce myself. The reason I'm telling you this little story is just to signify that the world is full of truly interesting people if we will pay attention to them. And as architects, we can be truly supportive of the world we live in when we do pay attention to the Elizabeth Brims and the Mary Ann Brittons and Mrs. Daughtry. She was comfortable living alone, she said. I've done without electricity for 38 years and without a car. I get along plain. Her son lived in Florida. I noticed that she restored her clothes. Her dress was darned together like the boards in her chicken house. That was 30 years ago. Now my memories are of yellow flowers along the roadside growing dark. That morning, Mrs. Daughtry gave me a mason jar of tomatoes she had recently put up. Then I left her to be on time for a contractors meeting. To me, time was money to be exchanged for clothes and cars. For her, time was life. Driving home to Raleigh that night, I saw an oil lamp in her window, shining in the dark. That's, of course, when I made this little sketch. Thank you. Now, I'm hoping you'll ask some questions so that I can tell you what I forgot to say.
Well, I'll ask you a question.
Absolutely.
Frank, what are the recent things? and this is something I want to get out before I forget. There are emails, you have a list of people that you send sketches with just a few words that you've written, just like this. And they just come into your email. I assume that anyone that wants to receive them, they don't have to, they don't have to purchase a book. They can see what you're thinking about and what meaning you find in nature or the built environment that has made you pause. You came to my office today, and I had a book of poems by Robert Frost, and I knew that you'd read Robert Frost. And we talked about that. And in this hurly-burly world that we're all in, the fleeting moment where you could pause and see something that makes you kind of recalibrate what's important. I think that's what I love about your sketches. But perhaps somehow you'll let the McNay know through us or otherwise how people can get on this email release list, because it's something. Rosemary, I see you in the front. I think you look at them, don't you?
It's actually down there in the lower left-hand side.
Oh, is it? Okay. So is that where people go to see what you're thinking about?
You can also sign up, and I'll send you one.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my question would be, what are the more recent ones that you've done, and what has caught your fancy?
Well, it's interesting. I always have a sketchbook with me, and I might notice something in the news or something I read, and it reminds me of a sketch I've made. And so I'll go back and look at that sketch and try to think of something that I could write about that sketch that wouldn't describe the sketch, but would use the sketch as a way to build on a thought or even an idea. Like I say, I just was driving by one night and I made this sketch of Mrs. Daughtry's house and went on, and I wrote this years later, right? Because I was thinking at the time about how most of us think that time is money. And it occurred to me that Mrs. Daughtry knew that that was not true. She knew that time was life. And so I sat down to write this. Now the sketch takes 5 minutes to make. I'll do that on purpose so that I don't try to make the sketch beautiful. It's just try to get I'm trying to understand what I'm looking at. But to write, that's less than 200 words, takes at least 5 hours. Each word, you change one word up there in the first sentence, it's going to ripple down to the last paragraph. So it's not unlike designing a building. You've got everything all laid out, and the client wants the kitchen bigger. And that's going to ripple through the whole thing, and it's no different writing something, if you think of that as a plan, that if you change a word, and the word has a meaning, that meaning and the rhythm and the sound of that word is going to ripple through the rest of what you do. So, and I found it very enjoyable. And as you could tell by the one I wrote about the Creek children, it's so important to be able to put a name to our thoughts, to be able to write our thoughts before we design something. I find that one of the most satisfying things about writing. I had a teacher when I was a student in England, and the English speak so beautifully. Language is extraordinary there. And my teacher there, his name was Peter Pragnell. Before I would design any project, he said, I want you to write down the 5 things that you want this project to have. And they couldn't be things like, well, I wanted to have lots of light in the bedrooms. You know, it couldn't be stuff like that. It would have to be, I want it to be a house that the owner is happy to wake up in, you know. And if you can write 5 things like that, it gives you a structure to think about design well before you've designed it, right? You know, I was actually having a real crisis designing my own house. It's hard, you know. And the first time I designed the house for me and Judy, we'd always had this dream of doing our own house. It looked like something Le Corbusier would have done, you know, with a little scoop of Richard Meyer thrown in. And of course, Judy turned it down, you know. And that's kind of shocking too. After I designed about 4 houses and gotten a rejection slip on every one, I went to see Harwell, you know, and I told him that I was having a struggle. And he told me 2 things. He said, one, Frank, here's one of the most distinguished architects in America. He was the only architect I know of that Frank Lloyd Wright actually praised, you know, and that's saying something. You know, Wright had an ego as big as an ocean liner, but he actually praised Harwell Harris. And Alvar Aalto was a friend of Harwell, and he said, the greatest architect in America is Harwell Harris, second only to Frank Lloyd Wright. So here was this very famous architect, very accomplished, comes here to Texas, design houses for the Trainer family. He told me that night, we're sitting in his outdoor living room. He said, you know, Frank, every time I get a new project, I'm terrified. I can't tell you how reassuring that was. You know? And he also said, you know, he reminded me that a building is a portrait. So I went away that night, walked home, and I didn't know what the design was going to be, but I knew that I was going to get there. You know? That's why I say words and writing can be such a wonderful way to think. Yeah.
So Frank,
Yes.
you've not been actually practicing. I know you draw, I think, constantly, and so generous about coming around and speaking to so many people, but you haven't been practicing for a few years.
That's right.
So share with us how that feels. I mean, because you just described something that we all experience, the stress of someone asking for something and then not liking what they're getting. And so tell us, are you happy?
I'm probably happier. Well, you know, my life will never be the same after Judy died. But apart from that, I'm as happy as I've ever been. And I never thought I would say that. You know, architecture is a very all-consuming endeavor. And I was pretty sure that I was going to have to work till the end of my life. And that I would want to. But a few things started to happen. One was I went to see my accountant, and he assured me that I could actually stop working and I would be okay. And then I started to notice that I was more excited that my daughter, who lived in New York, was coming down for a long weekend to see me than I was about starting the next project. And so I started to put these little dots together, and I thought, wait a minute, I can do other things. So I decided one of those things would be to write a book, you know, and that's where Native Places came from. I decided that I could spend my time going to see my children. I might even renew my study of butterflies, which I left off when I was 12 years old. And did you know that there are over 4,000 kinds of butterflies in North Carolina? So I eased into it, and at first I missed it a lot. You know what I missed the most? Is working with craftspeople, like Mike today that I talked to, about people who love to make things as much as I do and will help me realize something. That I miss. But as compensation, I get to enjoy the work that you do, and Marlon Blackwell does, and Johnny Grable does, you know, and that gives me great satisfaction too. Yeah. Yes.
I want to know is what are the pros and cons of sketching as opposed to like say old school photography or even digital photography?
What are the pros and cons of
Sketching.
sketching?
Yeah. Sketching. Drawing.
Well, the great value of sketching, and you've got some very good architects in this room tonight who also sketch beautifully, is that you can understand, you can try to find a way to understand what you're looking at. You can remember what you're looking at. And if you sketch all the time, you have a sketchbook with you, you've got this facility of sketching so that when an idea comes along about an outdoor classroom or a visitor center at Government Canyon, you're good at sketching, you know, and so you can use sketching as a way to explore that. I'm not discounting the value of photography, you know. A lot of times when I sadly don't have enough time to make a sketch, usually because one of my close family is really annoyed that I'm wasting time, you know, and wants to go on to the next thing. I take a photograph, yeah. Yes?
How many sketches do you think you've made in total?
I'm sorry, say that again, I couldn't hear you.
How many sketches do you think you've made in total?
More than 10 and less than 1 million.
Frank, before the evening gets too far advanced and we have to shut down, can you speak to the ease with which anyone can learn to sketch and draw? This is something that you taught me.
Such a good point.
Please speak about that and explain that it's just a progression and you make mistakes and you learn each way and you just, how long does it really take? Maybe not to draw as nicely as you did. I mean, that's beautiful what you projected. But I mean, to the point that you can get satisfaction in it.
Well, everybody sitting in this room was an artist when they were 5 years old. All of you were. I have so many people. I teach drawing, mostly to people who think they don't know how to draw. And what I tell them is that when you were 5 years old, you rivaled Picasso. You know, Picasso himself said that he was nowhere near as good as a child making a drawing because a child is totally uninhibited. I have a relation who, an extraordinary young man, and he's on the autistic spectrum. And the drawings that Lewis makes, they're totally unaffected by fashions or trends or what's in the art magazines or what teachers are saying. They're totally uninhibited. All of you had that quality when you were young, and sadly it gets educated out of you, you know. Somebody tells you you have to draw within the lines, or that, you know, cows aren't blue. Tell that to Chagall. So what I would say is get over any fears that you have of drawing. because you have it in you. You did it once, and I think you can do it again. You know, the best, when I teach my students, teach is the wrong word. We all go out and we sketch and we share our sketches with each other. I won't let anybody use an eraser, because one of the things that gets in the way of making a good drawing is perfection. You know, perfection is the enemy of art. If you try to make a drawing that's perfect, you'll be frustrated. So I hope that's a partial answer to your question. Yeah.
Frank,
Yes.
also, I've used your book with my grandchildren, 8-year-old twins. My granddaughter is quite talented, even at a very young age. And I've used it to do just exactly what you were saying, that very few, you do art with very few lines.
That's right.
And I've been working with her on occasion when she's drawing, and to show that a very quick sketch, and I use your book for examples,
Mm-hmm.
and it's amazing when she picks up on something that sometimes just a squiggle is what you need for that particular sketch. And so I think your book is almost a teaching instrument for those who want to learn to sketch without, with abandon.
With abandon, what a nice way to say it.
Yeah.
That's a very nice thing to say. Thank you for saying that. You know, I have a friend, her name is Grace Ladner. She's 9 years old, and she has a sketchbook. And she came to my house one day and made a sketch of the house. Now, I got my college students who also come there, and we have sketching sessions. But Grace, 9 years old, sees more things in this house than my college students see, you know, the things that she notices, because she's uninhibited. You know, the trouble is, as we grow older and the world is full of 10 million things, we have to learn to edit. And so we sort of edit into what we think is important. Grace doesn't have those filters. So she draws the house, and there's a Navajo rug hanging up off the balcony. She puts that in there, you know. Yeah. Yes.
First off, a fantastic lecture.
Thank
you
you.
for coming. So I have a question about kind of how you view sketching in your design process. Because Ioanni Plasma says that sketches allow us to see and kind of tap into our unconscious. And I was curious about if you thought that in your sketches you kind of see into the unconscious of yourself and kind of removing those restrictions, and if that helps you see the uniqueness in places and the specificity that you talked about earlier.
Well, what an interesting, good question. This is what I would say about sketching, is that when I sketch, I'm totally in the present. Nothing distracts me. And how many times do we get to do that in the course of a day, right? We live in a world that's overcharged with distractions. And if you're making a sketch, the only thing you're going to be focused on is what you're looking at and trying to see. And to me, that's the primary value. There are those that would argue philosophically that being in the present is all we have in life. Mrs. Daughtry knew that. Yeah.
Maybe one more question, and then we're going to be almost an hour from the beginning. I think it's a good time to stop. And Frank's here afterwards if anyone wants to say hello, for sure.
Yes, sir, I can on the listing to come here, it says till 7:30, so I'll take all 30 minutes after 7:30. Part of that punctuality.
I know.
I thought I had an hour and a half.
Someone had a question up there? Yes. Well, I can tell you about the groupings in the book and where they came from. A friend of mine helped me. His name is Charles Lynn, and we met in the Rose Library of the New York Public Library, the Rose Library room, a gorgeous room. And I had a little reproduction of every sketch, and we spread them all out. You know, there were like 300 of them, and there are only 64 in the book. And we didn't know what the groupings and categories would be because I don't work that way. You know, I have a friend who's a writer. She writes very beautifully about architecture, and she knows what her chapters are going to be when she starts, you know. And my way is more spontaneous. And so we discovered the groupings. It was fascinating, you know. Yeah. And then we came up with one final category because we would come up with groupings about the value of a particular place. Another grouping might be about travel. And we had some that we really loved and we didn't know where they went because there was no group that fitted them. And we called that left luggage. You know? And so that's the last chapter, is left luggage. You know?
So I checked with the McNay, and we have the lecture hall and the facility till 7:30. The additional time was to allow those that might want to have a book inscribed. So I'd like to request that we stop now, and those of you that would like to come forward and have Frank inscribe a book, do so. If you have a question that you didn't get a chance to ask, come forward, and I'm sure Frank will be happy to answer. Thank you all so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you.